discussing about how do we account for overheads, right? Now, beginning, we will, as we said earlier, overhead expense is a sum total of indirect materials, indirect wages, and indirect expenses. And you have set examples for each of it. I have also put few examples in this slide. So, for example, if you look at the indirect material, the best example is maybe the cotton waste or the oil, the lubricating oil which you use for making your machinery perform effectively, or some small parts of tools which is common to all the departments or to all the production departments. So such materials which cannot be directly identified from a finished product, which and it cannot be directly allocated to a finished product. Like, you don't know how much of oil you've been used at the time of the manufacturing process. You don't know how much of other cotton waste is used for cleaning for during the production activity. So you don't know how much of it is used during the production activity, but you know the sum total of it being used for different segments. If that is the case, then that will be brought under the category of indirect materials. Now, coming with indirect labor, as we said, when the effort of a particular person is not directly identified with a product or service, that will be coming under the category of indirect labor. So that would be coming under the category of indirect labor. Means, we said the example of, see, in a factory there might be managers, supervisors who would be looking after the work of different departments. Right, they are common to different departments. If that is the case, and if there is no specific time being recorded for the supervision of each department, definitely their contribution to the existing labor would not be directly identifiable by from each department, by allocating the cost to each department. So in that case, we will bring that under the category of indirect labor, and we will have to go with some kind of allocation based on maybe the working hours, based on the usage, all these things. So the salary of a foreman cannot be directly identified with a particular department. If that is the case, in some cases, yes, you have exclusive supervisor to a specific department. In that case, that comes as direct labor. But if the supervisor or if the manager or if the staff is common to many departments, in that case, you cannot directly identify the cost, the labor cost with that service or with that finished product. Those will be brought under the category of indirect labor. Now, coming with indirect expense. Again, in this case also, these might be common expenses that has been incurred for the organization as a whole. For example, you took an insurance for the building, for the building of your maybe office, of your the entire factory being covered under one single insurance, right? So in that case, you took fire insurance, or you took theft insurance to protect against the losing your product or something. The insurance as such is common too. Maybe you took insurance for the health of the workers, right? So the expense which you pay for the whole department is not identifiable directly. If that is the case, that will be brought under the category of indirect expense. I have put a few examples like rent. If the rent is paid for the whole building, then I put insurance. If the insurance premium is paid for the whole, maybe you cover the entire organization in one umbrella plan, insurance plan, then it is pretty difficult for you to separate that. In that case also, you cannot identify with each product what is the expense you have incurred for your insurance. It's not possible. In that case, you will go with considering indirect expense, that as indirect expense. So these are the three components for overhead. So I repeat, the three components for overhead would be indirect expense. Overhead expense would be indirect expense, indirect labor, and indirect material cost. Right. So when we're talking about overhead accounting, we are trying to account all these under the broad heading called overhead expenses. We are trying to look into that aspect. Till now, we were looking into how do we go with computation of material cost. Material cost is very important for a production, a factory which is going with the production process, manufacturing process. Then we just looked upon how do we go with computation of labor cost. Right there, we learned about basically two types of system, which is piece rate system and time rate system. Today we are going to look at the indirect expense part. Okay, indirect expense part, which is not part of any other expense, which is not directly identifiable from a particular product or a service. Okay, now going further, see the steps involved in overhead allocation or apportionment of overhead to different departments. Okay, basically production departments. That I will tell you at a later stage, but the steps involved, which we are going to learn as different stages in this chapter, would be: first is collection of overhead expenses. It's nothing but you are trying to understand what is the actual nature, what is the amount of overhead expenses that come under the overhead category. That's all about collection. The next stage is you have to classify them. You have to classify them in order to allocate that to or apportion that to different departments. Now, allocation and apportionment carries different meaning, okay, which I'm going to explain in the coming discussions. So the first stage is collection. You are collecting it, then you have to classify that, and then allocation and apportionment to production and service cost centers. An organization would be having maybe a production department, as well as there are many service departments, right? So the total overhead expenses need to be allocated and apportioned to them, and then after that it is reapportioned to the production department, because service department as such, we will talk about these assumptions at a later stage, but we are going to apportion all the expenses which we have initially based on its occurrence, we have allocated to the service department. That again is reapportioned to the production department. That's the next stage. And finally, we go with the ascertainment of overhead rates and absorption to different products. Now, finally, why do we go with computation of this overhead expenses? We want the cost to be allocated to each product being produced by the department. Say, for example, you have many services which is being rendered in an organization, but as such, you don't get direct revenue for this. Your revenue may be by, if it is a service industry, of course, that is a different case. I'm talking about a manufacturing sector. In a manufacturing company, your revenue basically comes from selling the products. Right. So every cost which has incurred in your organization need to be allocated or need to be identified with a particular unit of product, if you really have to get back your cost incurred in that production process. So that is what we assume to be our final stage. Finally, you are actually allocating, you are giving, you are absorbing the cost to each production units, each product unit, or to each finished product, so that you will get a revenue for it. You are going to sell. So you know the total cost incurred for production of that particular product. So these are the things which we have to remember. So first, we are just trying to understand, we are collecting it, then we are classifying that into different categories. And after classification, there are two stages, that is allocation as well as apportionment, and then reapportionment happens, and finally we are giving that, we are finally implementing that in a particular unit, in a finished product. How much of that will contribute to the total cost of that we will know by doing this particular process. So in today's class, we will be discussing till what is collection, what is classification, what is allocation and apportionment. That is what we are going to do in today's class. Reapportionment, ascertainment, the discussion, and we have to do exercise on all these. Right. So that reapportionment and ascertainment, we will take it to our next class. So first stage is classification. So as I said, in classification, the expenses are extracted. You are trying to find out what can be brought under the category of indirect expense, indirect labor, as well as indirect material cost. That is what we call as the classification. So okay, what is the cost incurred? See, I would say the primary thing would be the journal entries. When you get it, when you bring the product, when you purchase the product, you might be purchasing in bulk. So you will have the journal entries for that. From that, then you will have the stores ledger, right? Then you will also have different cash books, stores requisition. See, the requisition from coming from each department. So it might be they will say that I need one box of cotton, which can be used for the production. So for a month they might be using one box, depending upon how far you are producing. But the extraction is the most important stage, because if I cannot find that, then I cannot account for it. So the first and foremost and most important stage is extraction of these overhead costs. Okay, extraction of these costs from different sources. That's the first stage. And then the next stage is classification. There are different ways of classifying. It might vary from organization to organization, but basically that needs to be categorized properly depending upon some parameter, which we are going to discuss, some parameter, so that we don't leave a particular category of expense. So every organization, depending upon the product they are producing, depending on the nature of their operation, depending upon their practices, the parameter in which the classification is done may vary. Okay. But primarily, there should be some classification to go with the systematic process. So as you know, the word classification is all about grouping. Grouping. Grouping can be based on basic functions. Basic functions, I have put few examples, like if it is production related, if it is related with the production department, or maybe no administration department. So you are just categorizing your overhead, indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expense based on your functions. So function can be production function, administrative function, selling function, distributing functions. Based on that, you are going to classify. That can be one way of classifying. Then the second one is elements or incidents. See, that is very easy for you to do, because elements of existence can be broadly classified into indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expense. Okay, so basically that can be classified into indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expense. That's actually elements of classification. Then the next one, which we have, I have discussed only few based on your existing syllabus, but there are n number of ways of classifying depending upon the nature of that particular organization. Now, the next one we would be discussing is behavior wise. See, behavior wise in the sense behavior of that particular or nature of that accrual of that particular cost. Say, for example, fixed, variable, semi-variable. Fixed, the best example I can say is, in normal case, the rent you pay for your building would be fixed. It will not change from time to time. Even though it is an indirect expense, I know that I have to pay maybe 10,000 for my rent every month. So that's fixed. Then variable can be, say, for example, the oil, the other materials which you use for maintenance of your machinery. It will vary depending on the usage. Suppose if you have not used it no, as extensively as you had been using, maybe the indirect material cost would be very less. Right. Indirect labor cost, of course, if the factory was shut for some time, okay, then maybe your indirect labor cost would be very less. So depending on how you are going to use it, what is the behavior of that cost, you can classify that into fixed, variable, semi-variable. Semi-variable is partially that might be fixed. After that, say for example, minimum wage for electricity might be fixed, but after you exceed a particular level, it will depend on your usage. So that is semi-variable. So they're based on behavior of your cost. And the last two is very easy. Controllability. Controllable and uncontrollable. Certain expenses are controllable with good management. See, maybe wastage can be limited if you have a tight control, if you have a good supervision. But unnecessary wastage can be avoided. But of course, certain industry, no, there is something called as normal wastage, which is not controllable even with strict supervision. So you can say that, say for example, if you talk about the example of paint industry, right? Paint industry, they will be having certain level of wastage due to evaporation, depending on the climate. Variation in the climate, that evaporation, paint loss due to evaporation may vary, but definitely you will be having certain rate of decrease in the quantity of paint due to evaporation. Right. So likewise, that it is very difficult for you to control. You can go with many measures, but still there would be some level of uncontrollability in that. So controllable and uncontrollable. That is another way of classifying. Then the last one is normal and abnormal. Certain cost, overhead expenses, it is very normal to happen, but certain overhead expenses may be incurred in an abnormal situation. So for example, you went with last 2018, almost all in Kerala, all the industries in Kerala suffered because of flood. Some of them suffered to extreme extent, right? So they wanted to go with cleaning their factory premises. They wanted to again repaint it, because of it's not a normal condition, it's not a normal expense, but they had to incur that expenses. So that is where we call as a normal and abnormal case. You don't know what is the total expense, you don't know how much is the total expense which is incurred for each department, but you know that the total expense incurred for cleaning the entire organization and its premises is this much. So that is not identifiable with a particular product or a service. At the same time, you know that you have incurred it in an abnormal condition. Normal cleaning, you know the cost. But this, because there was a flood, the cleaning techniques, the cleaning effort needed to be changed. So that is an abnormal condition. You incurred high cost on that. So that is what you call as a normal and abnormal cost. Abnormal is something which will happen in certain conditions due to some uncertain or some unpredictable scenario, some unpredictable occurrence, right? So that's what we call as a direct and indirect expenses classification on the basis of we can go with classification on the basis of functions, where we said that functional departments, different functional departments, that's a basic criteria for classifying them. Then elements, of course, from the beginning we had been learning. So based on elements, if we classify, that would be indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Behavioral wise, if we go with the classification, it's very easy for us to understand. Fixed. One is fixed. If your overhead expense is fixed for a considerable amount of time, that will come under the fixed overhead. But if it is varying depending on your level of operations, it will be coming under the variable indirect expenses. And then, of course, you can also classify on the basis of controllability as well as on the basis of normalcy of the situation, normal, abnormal, right? So that's all about classification. So in nutshell, classification is nothing but grouping in order to facilitate a better accounting of cost. Now, the third part which we will be discussing in today's class is allocation and apportionment. This is now we identify the cost, then we classify. Now we have to allocate that to different departments, right? Different departments or different service. It can be production departments or service departments, but we really have to allocate it. And that part is what we call as allocation and apportionment. So you have a cost, you categorize that, right? Now we know that, yes, this particular cost belongs to production department. This particular cost belongs to selling department. This particular cost belongs to research department. So that is what we call as allocation and apportionment. So it is apportionment. That is why it is called as primary distribution or departmentalization of overhead. Primary distribution, you are just allocating, right? And of course, the groups can include production department, service department, or partly producing department. See, some of the department won't engage in continuous production process. They will be going with production only in certain important exclusive scenarios. So that is what we call as partly production departments, right? So groups include for allocation and apportionment can be categorized as production, service, as well as partly production departments. And one thing which is very important for you to understand is, why do we use these two separate terms for allocation? Why do we, allocation is enough, then where comes this, the concept of apportionment? That's something which you really have to understand. In simple words, okay, if you can fully identify a particular indirect expense as a whole to one department, that is allocation. If we can wholly allocate one particular expense to a department, that will be definitely allocation. Say, for example, if I can correctly, I have put an example, the best example which you can easily understand. If I know that overtime wages, okay, overtime wages, which is being incurred by department A, department B, department C, definitely I can allocate the total overtime expenses of department A to that department itself, right? Likewise, the total overtime expenses, so overtime salary being paid to the employees of department B, if I know how much is the total of that, I can straight away allocate that to department B. Same as the case with C, because I know exactly how much is the overtime expenses or how much is the amount paid towards overtime wages for the employees in department A, department B, department C. I don't have to have a proportion. I can wholly give that to allocate as the cost of department A, B, and C respectively. That's the case of allocation. But in case of apportionment, the term which you have to understand is, I cannot separately wholly identify the expense, the cost allocated with a particular department. It is very difficult for me to identify that separately as it belongs to a particular department. In that case, I will have to go with proportionate allocation based on some kind of justification. Say, for example, research. The expense connected with research. Okay, expense connected with research. its research is actually a service I know it is not a revenue earning department. So the expense of research department need to be allocated to different production and service department. But I don't know how to exactly allocate that to different departments. I cannot identify how much to A, how much to department A, how much to department B, how much to department C. I can only go with proportionate allocation. Pro rata, on some basis. That can be based on the revenue earning capacity, that can be based on the impact. It depends on the particular condition. But definitely, I cannot identify that expense directly to a particular product. It can be an expense that can be split to different departments. Likewise, if I am not in a position to identify a particular indirect cost wholly or in total belonging to a particular department, that will be brought under the category of apportionment. It's very important for you to understand the distinction between allocation and apportionment. In short, allocation will happen only when the expense is in total identifiable to a particular department. That's why I put it, the allotment of all items of cost to the cost centers of cost unit. So we use the word allocation when the expense is in whole being or can be taken to a particular department. Okay, but apportionment is used when there is only proportional allotment of overhead expenses possible. It's very important for you to understand. If you understand this, reapportionment will be easy for you to understand. Right. So to summarize, I will just quickly recap what we had been discussing in today's class. We were talking about how do we account for overhead expenses. As we know, overhead expenses is a total of indirect material, indirect labor, as well as indirect expenses. Right. Then we discussed about the steps in computation and allocation and also absorption of overhead costs to production units or to the final product. As simple as that. How do we absorb that? How do we relate that to the final product? In that, 3 stages we discussed in our today's class. First one is identification, extraction. You're trying to find out what are the various categories of overhead costs that is being incurred by our firm. Second one is, once we identify, we have to classify, categorize, or group that. And that grouping can be on different bases. We discussed it can be on the basis of behavior. It can be on the basis of element. It can also be on the basis of function, normality, or it can be on the basis of controllability. Right. Then as on third stage, we discussed the concept of allocation and apportionment. Allocation is if a particular cost can be wholly allocated, fully allocated to a particular department, maybe on classified on the basis of functional, classified on functional basis, or it can be classified on element basis. But if that can be wholly in total allocated to a particular department, that will be called as allocation. If the cost is in nature that it cannot be wholly related to a particular department, but there needs some proportionate method or some proportionate allocation needed, then that will be called under the category of apportionment. Right? Thank you. So we stop here. Okay. Now, if you have any doubt,